Hey guys, Pastor Kent here. I'm kind of excited to be with you today at the podcast studio. We're going to talk about climate change. And the reason I wanted to talk about that is because there seems to be a lot of confusion concerning it. And it's creeping into the church and creating a lot of consternation and conflict that is unnecessary. And it's dividing the church into two camps. And I think that the general argument about climate change is misunderstood by most Christians. I remember I was talking to a staff member about 10 years ago about climate change. He was in seminary and his professors were telling him how bad the climate was going to destroy the world and all the, kind of extreme positions that you hear out there. And I remember asking him, could you explain it to me? And he literally took an hour and he got all done. And I said, that makes no sense to me and I'm still confused. You haven't persuaded me at all. And he had a kind of puzzled look on his face, and I began to ask him questions about the things I was confused over based on what he said, and he was confused. And it's very clear that he didn't understand it either. And the reason is because a lot of people deal with broad, sweeping generalities rather than the particulars about an issue of what is known as climate change. And climate change is a new idea in the sense that they use the term, those who hold to it use that term because the previous term, global warming, wasn't really able to be justified scientifically. So now they say that global warming isn't a problem, global cooling is a problem. Then they come back and say global warming is a problem, and there tended to be basically a contradiction, and that would make sense because honestly, when you look at all the data, you'll find that the issues really are about the change in the weather patterns. That's climate, change in weather patterns. That's the best you can define it. No one who holds to climate change as a crisis is willing to define it beyond that. At least I haven't come across it. But the biggest question for us is it a problem? And to me, this is very much like the evolution argument. And the evolution argument is that, some Christians overreact and say there's no evolution. And then obviously the atheist evolutionist says there's tons of evolution. And when you get down to it, the truth is there's microevolution. We can breed two dogs and come up with a different dog and things like that. But they're all limited to certain categories that God has established in his divine order when he created the universe. And you cannot breed a dog with an elephant and have a delephant or whatever you would call it. It goes beyond the borders of the change that God's established. And it's the same thing. Is the climate changing? Yes, it's changing, and it's changing up and down. And there's lots of confusion upon that change. So let me give you some examples of some of the statements about climate change that have taken place in the past that leads to this kind of confusion. So, I'm going to use the kind of apocalyptic scenarios. And the reason I'm mentioning these is I remember all the way back in high school that we were told it was going to be the end of the world because there's a hole in the ozone layer and the ozone is going to end up killing us. Turns out smog was a benefit and it actually patched the whole ozone layer, so that never happened. A lot of weird stuff happens that you can't predict when you talk about these kinds of things. But let me give you some examples. In 1967, Stanford biologist named Paul Ehrlich said that it was already too late, end quote, to stop a long famine period that would be at its worst in 1975, and literally huge portions of the world would starve to death. Well, it didn't happen. In 1970, many scientists predict a new ice age. See, this is when I was growing up. I was in high school. This is what they were talking about, the global cooling, the ice age that was coming, and that it would the new ice age by the 21st century would deplete all of the rivers in the U.S. and there would be a lack of oxygen in the atmosphere, and they predicted hundreds of thousands of people dying from this climate catastrophe. Then in 1989, the sea waters were rising, and it was thought to obliterate entire nations by the year 2000. Well, they didn't. Then in 2008, and here's a great one, the Arctic was expected to be free of sea ice in the summer by 2018. Well, 2018 came and passed and nothing happened. Then I just read a study I was preparing for this podcast where it was predicted that the polar bear population was going to significantly take a dive because of the climate change and the global warming, and their habitat would be taken from them and they'd be dying by the thousands, tens of thousands. Well, guess what? From the time that statement was issued till today, the polar bear population has been growing. The point is, we have a lot of different people saying all kinds of I would say, fear porn is the thing I would call it, just constantly creating fear and worry. And my concern as a pastor is that Christians look at this whole issue with a Christian worldview. And so I want to go through some of the important things that we need to understand when we talk about climate change from a biblical point of view and establishing a Christian worldview. And then maybe we'll get into a little bit of the details of the statistics and the research that's being done. Number one, I would say that as Christians, remember, we're dealing with this as from a Christian point of view, as we're not to worry about the existential threat to the earth, because God promises to preserve the functioning of the earth as long as the earth exists, and that would be until Jesus returns. In Genesis 8:22, God says this in his word, while the earth remains, that's as long as there's a globe here, seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. So we will never destroy the vegetation and the sustainability of the earth to take care of humanity as long as the earth is in existence. And this was after the flood. God said that. Then in Colossians 1:17, the Bible says this, he, and it refers to Jesus Christ, is before all things, and in him all things hold together. In other words, as Christians, we believe that God is sovereignly in charge of all of this and that he has created this planet for us to grow and to flourish. He says we are to rule and subdue it, and we are to have dominion over the entire earth, over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, obviously the plants and the vegetation on the face of the earth, and the animals that are on that that feed off of that vegetation. God's said that's our goal. He's provided the earth for us to flourish and to thrive on that. And we can't destroy it by our own hands. God is going to sustain it, and he does sustain it until Jesus comes back. And we know what happens when Jesus comes back, that he gives us a new heaven and a new earth after the great and final day of judgment, and then we'll be back in Edenic paradise, just like Eden, on earth as God originally intended it. So for Christians, we should never be worried or scared by all the people making these apocalyptic predictions about the end of the world. Now, if you read the book of Revelation, you realize there's a lot of bad stuff that God pours out on the world as acts of his sovereign judgment upon those unbelievers who've hardened their heart towards him. And they include climate catastrophes. And nothing a man can do is going to stop them. And that is going to happen in the end of days, the final 7 years of human history as we know it. But before then, there's nothing we can do, and we need not worry about it or sweat it. The second thing that I want to say from a Christian's point of view is that we're to care for the creation that God gave us and use it for our good and his glory. And that's why it says in Genesis 1:28, God blessed mankind, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over every living thing that moves on the earth. In other words, our job is to take all of God's creation, work it with our hands, and develop a beautiful, thriving environment that reflects Eden throughout the rest of the world. And we do that for our own good and flourishing and for the glory of God. Which the key idea is very simple. As humans, and especially as Christians, our job is to use the world but not abuse it. Wasteful, foolish, toxic, behaviors of dumping poison in streams and things like that. Of course, that's completely against anything that God would want. But we are to be faithful stewards of the creation that we have. The question is, how do we balance that? And we'll talk about that a little bit later. The third thing is we opt for policies then that maximize human flourishing and minimize human suffering. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 10, verses 29 to 31, these words. He said, are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? And not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father? But even the hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear not, therefore, you are of more value than many sparrows. What's he saying? The main thing we are to be concerned with is living our life, pleasing God, and using the resources that he's given to us without panic or fear to flourish in this world that he's given to us. It will sustain us until Jesus gets back. That's what the really promise is. And whenever you think about that, you always come to the thought comes to my mind is, okay, aren't I supposed to be concerned a little bit about the future? Yes, you are supposed to in terms of planning and being responsible, but not taking on the responsibility of the health of the universe on your shoulders. This will lead to all kinds of difficulty and unnecessary anxiousness in your own personal life. God has the world and the earth, and nothing's going to happen to it outside of his sovereign control. And he has promised that seed time and harvest and rain and snow and the seasons are going to take place as planned from day one until he comes back. We don't need to worry about it. So relax. God's in control. And as a Christian, that needs to be our worldview and not panic. And we don't abuse the creation, like I just said. And then number 4, that means we can live with peace of mind because we believe that ultimately God is in control of everything, including the weather. In Psalm 148, verses 7 and 8, the Bible says, "Praise the Lord from all the earth, you creatures of the ocean depths, fire and hail, snow and clouds, wind and weather that obey him." See that? The weather obeys God, just like the seas obey God, just like the snow and the rain obeys God. God is in charge sovereignly over everything that happens on the face of the earth, and he is a good and loving God. His loving kindness endures forever, the Bible says in Psalm 136, says it 26 times in that chapter of the Bible. He's emphasizing God is going to take care of us, and we don't need to worry about these gigantic things like weather and rain and snow and all of that. We just plan appropriately and don't fear. In Jeremiah 10:13, the Bible says, "When God utters his voice, there is tumults of waters in the heavens, and he causes the clouds to ascend from the end of the earth. He makes lightning for the rain, and he brings out the wind from his storehouses." In other words, a very graphic picture that God is intimately concerned with everything that takes place on the earth, and he is able to sovereignly set the limits and the direction of how it happens. He is in control, not us. So it is very clear, according to the Bible and from a Christian worldview, that God is sovereign over everything, including the weather. We can have an impact on it. And so we are to be responsible in how we handle the things that we handle in terms of the impact it may make on the environment around us. And we should always leave the environment in better shape than when we found it. As a Christian, that's the appropriate way to handle these kinds of things. With that general mindset, I want to talk a little bit about some of the issues that come up in climate change. One of the first things you'll hear whenever you talk about climate change is people will say that 97% of scientists agree that there is a serious problem with climate change and global warming, and that unless something is done by 2050, there will be a catastrophic event that will be devastating on the earth due to this. And that 97% of scientists agree to that, and that these problems are caused by human behaviors, in particular the burning of fossil fuels more than anything, but that's essentially what it is. That it's attributed primarily to human action. So I decided I wanted to find out where this 97% figure came from. So I was doing some research, and I came across an extensive article, a great article. I'll leave it in the podcast notes, and you should read it. It's got guy's researcher, and he has 86 different citations in his article of scientific journals validating about what he's talking about. And here, in the middle of this article, he says this about the 97% figure. He says this: "In the United States, the Global Warming Petition Project has garnered the signatures of 31,500 scientists resident in the United States alone, including over 9,000 with PhDs." That's 9,000 with PhDs. "Who dispute the claim that CO2 will cause serious problems. This alone casts doubts on the 97% figure." And that would make sense, because that would be 9,000 scientists would make up 3% of the scientists, because 97% would disagree with them. If you divide that out, that would mean that there would be over 300,000 PhDs in the field of climate change. That would be hard to believe that many exist on the planet. So this immediately triggered my thinking, wait a second. There's not 300,000 scholarly PhDs in the world. That's not even possible to have that many. So something's going on. So you dig a little deeper, and he says this justification of the 97% has been in a paper in 2013 that, based on the abstracts of nearly 12,000 climate science papers published from 1991 to 2011, concluded that 97% of those who expressed an opinion endorsed the consensus view that, quote, humans are causing global warming, end quote. Based on this, remember, it was published in 2011. Based on this, former President Obama's Twitter account declared, quote, 97% of scientists agree climate change is real, man-made, and dangerous, end quote. And then the writer says, note how the paper's claim morphed from humans are causing some global warming into all climate change is man-made and dangerous. This is deceitful. Moreover, the study was conducted by members of another activist group called Skeptical Science, which exists to promote public acceptance of AGW. That's anthropomorphic or anthropogenic, that's what it is, anthropogenic global warming, AGW. When you read the literature, that's how they use it. When the raw data are examined, now catch this is really important. When the raw data are examined, according to the author's own ratings, only 64 of the nearly 12,000 papers actually claimed that most of the warming was caused by human activity. Get that. 64 out of 12,000. Let's go further. In a follow-up analysis of the same paper, other researchers found that only 41 of those 64 papers endorsed the position that most of global warming was man-made. So now we've even narrowed it down to even fewer when you look at the original documents that President Obama's tweet was based on. Then he goes on to say, taking into consideration that 2/3 of the papers expressed no view, that 66% had no view, that amounts to less than 1% of the papers that expressed a view at all. This is actually a trivial finding. So the 97% figure is a dishonest twisting of statistics, and the activists' own raw data show that very few scientists agree even most of the warming is due to human activity, let alone that it is dangerous. Let me read that sentence again because this is huge. This is a trivial finding. So the 97% figure is a dishonest twisting of statistics, and the activists' own raw data show that very few scientists even agree that most of the warming is due to human activity, let alone that it is dangerous. Very, very important conclusion. So when I got to the bottom of that, there isn't 97% of the scientists agree and believe that. It's a very, 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 very narrow margin. And in fact, there is a bunch of scientists that are reacting to the false representation of the climate change data, and they want to remove their name from being associated with it in any form or fashion. And so let me read to you, and you can find this on the web. It's a web page that is called, I'll basically include it in the notes, but it's a web page of scientists who disagree, and there's 1,107 of these scientists. Let me read that. When you go to the website by these scientists, it starts out with, there is no climate emergency. That's the opening statement, headline of the entire website. The website is just a list of the things I'm going to read you, and then signatures of these 1,100 scientists that basically want nothing to do with this exaggeration. He said, here's how it says. A global network of over 1,100 scientists and professionals has prepared this urgent message. Climate science should be less political, while climate policy should be more scientific. Scientists should openly address uncertainties and exaggerations in their predictions of global warming, while politicians should dispassionately count the real costs as well as the imagined benefits of their policy measures. And then it has these following little headings. Natural as well as anthropogenic factors cause warming. There you go. We contribute a little, but there's other things that contribute a whole lot more. Geological archives reveal that the Earth's climate has varied as long as the planet has existed, with natural cold and warm phases. The Little Ice Age ended recently as 1850. Therefore, there's no surprise that we are now experiencing a period of warming. So we just came out of a mini ice age in 1850. It's interesting. All of the climate scientists who claim that we have a problem take us back to 1850 and say that's the ideal temperature that the Earth should be at. And if it varies over 1.5 points Celsius, then that means that we're in a danger zone and it is threatening to human life. They're taking a measurement at the end of a mini ice age. And of course it's going to warm up. We just came out of an ice age in terms of the history of the geologic history of the globe. Number 2, warming is far slower than predicted. The world has warmed significantly less than predicted by the IPCC, that's its international council, on the basis of modeled anthropogenic forcing. The gap between the real world and the modeled world tells us that we are far from understanding climate change. Remember, this is a statement by 1,107 scientists who say here's our real protest. And you can sign on it as a scientist if you want at the end. That's all this website is just this public statement that they're making. Then the next statement they make. Climate policy relies on inadequate models. Climate models have many shortcomings and are not remotely plausible to global policy tools. They blow up the effect of greenhouse gases such as CO2. In addition, they ignore the fact that enriching the atmosphere with CO2 is actually beneficial. So having greater CO2 in the atmosphere is actually beneficial. It actually creates a greater environment for vegetation to grow. And there's greater vegetation on the face of the earth today than there has ever been in human history that we're aware of. The world is greening more and more. Next statement they have, CO2 is plant food, kind of what I was just saying. The basis of all life on Earth. CO2 is not a pollutant. It is essential to life on Earth. Photosynthesis is a blessing. More CO2 is beneficial for nature, greening the Earth. Additional CO2 in the air has promoted growth in global plant biomass. It is also good for agriculture, increasing the yields of crops worldwide. So the CO2 isn't a problem in and of itself. We can get into more esoteric data. Maybe I will, depending how long I'm going to go on this podcast. Global warming has not increased natural disasters. There's no statistical evidence that global warming is intensifying hurricanes, floods, droughts, and such like natural disasters or making them more frequent. However, there's ample evidence that CO2 mitigation measures are as damaging as they are costly. In other words, everything has to have a cost-benefit analysis, and everything they do to try to mitigate the CO2 does more damage and costs more than if you leave everything alone and allow it to naturally function. Climate policy must respect scientific and economic realities. And they say under that, there's no climate emergency. Therefore, there's no cause for panic and alarm. We strongly oppose the harmful and unrealistic net zero CO2 policy proposed for 2050. If better approaches emerge, and they certainly will, we have ample time to reflect and readapt. The aim of global policy should be, quote, prosperity for all, end quote, by providing reliable, affordable energy at all times. In prosperous societies, men and women are well educated, and birth rates are low, and the people care about the environment and prosper. And then the final statement, and then the signatures start, is their epilogue, quote, the World Climate Declaration, WCD, has brought a large variety of competent scientists together from all over the world. The considerable knowledge and experience of this group is indispensable in reaching a balanced, dispassionate, and competent view of climate change. From now on, our group will function as the Global Climate Intelligence Group. And then he has a few more notes, and that's it. So I want to refer you to a document that is in the Epoch Times, in the title of the article that was published on February 1st of this year, is Trillions Spent on Climate Change Based on Faulty Temperature Data, Climate Experts Say. That's the title of the article. Let me read you an introduction and then just kind of summarize some of the points, and you can read and get the details yourself. It starts with this. It says, to preserve a livable planet, the Earth can't warm more than 1.5 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels the United Nations warns. Failure to maintain that level could lead to several catastrophes, including increased droughts, weather-related disasters, more heat-related illnesses and deaths, and loss of food, more poverty, according to NASA. To avert the looming tribulations and limit global temperature increases, 194 member states of the European Union in 2016 signed the UN Paris Agreement, a legally binding international treaty with the goal to substantially reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. It's the 2050 figure to go to zero net carbon. That's the idea. The agreement, a legally binding international treaty with this goal. After the agreement, global spending on climate-related projects has increased substantially. In 2021 and 2022, the world's taxpayers spent an average of $1.3 trillion on such projects each year, according to the nonprofit advisory group Climate Policy Initiative. That's more than double the spending in 2019 and 2020, which came in at $653 billion per year, and it's significantly up from the $364 billion in the years 2011 and 2012. In other words, this thing is just growing out of control on trying to control the weather and the climate. Despite the money pouring in, the National Oceanic Atmosphere Administration, that's NOAA, reported in 2023 was the hottest year on record. And the NOAA's climate monitoring stations found that the Earth's average land and ocean surface temperatures in 2023 was 1.35 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial average. And remember, if it gets to 1.5, that's 0.15 more going up, then you're in catastrophic zone, and it's going to end into all these catastrophic problems. That's their claim. Quote, not only was 2023 the warmest year in the NOAA's 174-year climate record, it was the warmest by far, says Sarah Kapnick, NOAA's chief scientist. A warming planet means we need to be prepared for the impacts of climate change that are happening here and now, like extreme weather events that become both more frequent and severe. Yet, now listen to what the article's author says, yet a growing chorus of climate scientists are saying the temperature readings are faulty and that trillions of dollars pouring into it are based on a problem that does not exist. More than 90% of NOAA's temperature monitoring stations have a heat bias, according to Anthony Watts, meteorologist, senior fellow for environment and climate at the Heartland Institute and author of climate website What's Up With That, and director of a study that examined the NOAA's climate stations and claims. Quote, and with that large of a number, over 90%, the methods of NOAA employs to try to reach and reduce this doesn't work because the bias is so overwhelming, he told the Times. Few stations that are left are not biased because they are, for example, outside of town in a field or in an agricultural research station that's been around for 100 years. Their data gets completely swamped by the much larger set of biased data, and there is no way you can adjust that out, says meteorologist Roy Spencer. The surface temperature and thermometer data still have spurious warming effects due to the urban heat island, which increases over time. This is a principal research scientist at the University of Alabama, the U.S. science team leader for the Advanced Microwave Scanning Radiometer on the NASA Aquila satellite, and the recipient of NASA's Exceptional Scientific Achievement Medal for his work with satellite-based temperature monitoring. Mr. Spencer also said computerized climate models used to drive changes in the energy policy are even more faulty. Lieutenant Colonel John Shuchuk, a certified consulting meteorologist, said the problems with the temperature readings go beyond a heat bias. The retired lieutenant colonel was an advanced weather officer in the Air Force. Quote, after seeing many reports about NOAA's adjustments to the Historical Climatology Network temperature data, I decided to download and analyze the data myself, Lieutenant Colonel Chuckwick told the Times. I was able to confirm what others have found. It is obvious that, overall, the past temperatures were cooled while the present temperatures were warmed. In other words, they were ratcheted down in the past to be cooler and ratcheted up in the present to be hotter. He contends that the NOAA and NASA have adjusted historical temperature data in such a way as to make the past appear cooler, and by so doing, make the current warming trend seem more pronounced. Yikes. And he gives you some examples, and then I'll kind of stop here. He's got a lot of other great stuff, but he says this: we found stations, as he did further research, we found stations located next to the exhaust fans of air conditioning units, surrounded by asphalt parking lots and asphalt roads, and on blistering hot rooftops. In other words, they're cherry picking where they select these temperature readings, and they're putting them in a place that doesn't really read the atmosphere. It's reading some sort of artificial and temporary influence of the atmosphere by, obviously, a blacktop roof or an asphalt parking lot or next to the exhaust of an air conditioning unit. And then he goes on to explain that these temperature readers that are placed in these are now set so that they only take the high and the low of the day. So what it does is when that air conditioner comes on, it artificially heats that, and it's going to register as the high of the day, even though the general environment in the whole area isn't the high of the day. And so by manipulating the data in these ways, going back and changing the different things, they're able to say that we have a bigger crisis than we really do. And that's what's driving and fueling all of this confusion. When you look into it, you'll see that there are sincere scientists on the other side that say, well, here's what happens. The people who don't think that climate change is a problem, they just take a bunch of studies that are done by people who disagree, and those are garbage studies. They're not very good studies. We have the good studies. You need to trust us. Then when you go to the guys that say, hey, this climate thing isn't as severe as you say it is, and here, and we looked at your studies are garbage. They're not very well done. In other words, you have guys doing this, pointing across each other like this, trying to figure out who believes what and what's going on. And that creates greater confusion. So what I want to say about this whole thing, and you should read both of these articles if you're interested in this, to give you a lot of great understanding and research, is that there is a political aspect, and there is a scientific aspect, and there is a theological aspect to this issue. On the political side, it's being used to create and to wield power for people who have vested interests that they will benefit from personally. Almost all of the climate change people obviously are involved in the EV and manufacture and distribution of things. And those who aren't, they're in charge. They want to see more fossil fuels. The amazing thing is, and I was talked to an individual who is an executive with Southern California Edison who's retired, but he said, we now have the ability to take care of all of our energy needs with nuclear power that's safe, and it doesn't have an adverse effect on the climate at all. But no one wants to listen to that right now because there's this political thing going back and forth. And I can't claim to solve the political, and I'm not trying to. The second is the scientific. What you have to do is you have to read the studies and see if they're accurately being presented by both sides. And again, if you're not familiar with that, that's going to be over your head as well. So I tried to give you some different places that you can read up on it in kind of layman's terms. But the most important is the theological one. God has created this world. He's created it for us to flourish and survive. After the flood, he gave us a rainbow to say he'll never destroy the world like that again. And he goes on in that same section of the book of Genesis to promise that he is going to maintain seed planting and harvest, the seasons of the year, the weather, the water, and all the patterns. And it's going to sustain life on earth as long as the earth exists, which means and implies one day it's not going to exist like it does today. And that's when Jesus comes back and gives us a new heavens and a new earth. For as Christians then, we need to relax, not panic, understand that no man has the ability to destroy what God has sovereignly decided is going to continue to the end of days. Be wise, responsible with the things that God has given us in the environment. Don't waste it, don't abuse it, but use it for your good and for God's glory. And you don't need to worry about all this climate change stuff. Relax. God's in charge. God bless you. Thanks for listening.